Welcome, good morning, and welcome to today's workshop on Tricky Conversations. I'm Emily Stubbs, Policy and Projects Manager at the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce, and this event is part of our Growth Through People campaign. The GBCC Growth Through People campaign aims to help local firms boost productivity and grow through improved leadership and people management skills. This year it involves 8 free workshops, along with thought leadership, blog, video, and podcast content on the GBCC website throughout March. The campaign will end with a virtual conference on the 30th of March, which will feature a mixture of inspirational keynotes, thought-provoking panel discussions, and practical breakout workshops. I'd like to thank all of our headline sponsors for their support: the University of Birmingham's Work Inclusivity Research Centre, Aston University, and BMet College. And also like to give a huge thank you to our speakers today, Diane, Rance, and Fiona Anderson from Work Horizons, for their support of the campaign and also for leading today's session. Before I hand over to Diane and Fiona to kick us off, we have 2 anonymous poll questions that I'd like to ask you to fill out, which might spark some ideas for today's discussions and will crucially feed into our research into leadership and people management in the region. Brilliant. So do you think your work output has decreased, increased, or stayed the same during the COVID-19 pandemic? And has your overall sense of personal resilience changed over the last 12 months? These results are completely anonymous, so please do submit your answers and feed into our research. While you're doing that, I'll mention it now and at the end of today's session. If you could please complete the post-event survey, it would be massively appreciated. It's not just about event feedback, but also it will contribute into our research into leadership and people management in the region and help inform our work with local and national stakeholders on this agenda. We really appreciate every single response. Thank you, Sophie, for putting up that poll. If anyone is on social media, on Twitter or LinkedIn, please do join us during the session using the hashtag GTP21. And I hope you enjoy the session and take away some ideas to implement in your own businesses. Without any further ado, I will now hand over to Diane Rance and Fiona Anderson to share some of their techniques and expert advice on dealing with tricky conversations. Thank you,
Emily. Next slide, please. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be with you this afternoon. I'm Diane Rance, as Emily said. I'm delighted to be here for, I think, the 4th year doing tricky conversations as a topic for Growth Through People. As well as sitting on Chamber Council, I'm also here in my capacity as a coach. And a lot of my coaching that I do with individuals and with teams is about how to manage conversations effectively. And at the moment, there are a lot of tricky conversations either taking place or about to take place. So I'm delighted to be here with you today to share some of that experience. Work Horizons is an organisation that aims to help people, teams and individuals to become even better than they already are, to help them tackle some of those tricky people issues and also help organisations use their people to the best of their ability. I'll hand over to Fiona now to introduce herself.
So good afternoon, everyone. I wish I could say it's so lovely to see you, but like many of you, we're just looking at a screen, so hopefully next year. My background's in change and transformation, and currently the focus for me is really on culture change. How do we help our people? How do we create that organisation, working with leaders to really create that productive environment that everybody can be their very best on. So I also work for Work Horizons through coaching, facilitation, and really looking forward to hearing from you through the chat and through the Q&A, please. If you've got any questions, please use the Q&A. We look forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Diane.
Okay, I'll just pick up something that Zoe Lewis has put in the chat about questioning the use of the term use their people. We know in many organisations that managers and leaders have decisions about whether or not they're going to develop their people, whether or not they're going to listen to their people, whether or not they're going to engage with their people in a meaningful way in partnership. So when I say use their people, I don't mean literally take advantage of them. I mean how that relationship's going to be, how the individual is going to engage and be involved and develop within the workplace. So thank you, Zoe, for querying that, and I'll just clear that up. You're absolutely right, language is very powerful. Can we have the next slide, please? So our intention today is to help you increase your confidence and your competence around having difficult conversations. I started off in what was industrial relations nearly 40 years ago now, and learned my skills and my experience, and as Zoe says, around language and the importance of it in the early days in the car industry at the front line. So both Fiona and I will share our confidence and our competence today. So we'll share our skills in the aim of helping you with your confidence and competence. So that's the advantage for you. Advantage for your organisation as well as yourself is in doing so, we hope that you'll be able to minimise the costs that comes from conversations that are not effective. Sometimes conversations make things even worse than they were. Sometimes they just don't achieve their full objectives. So our help today is around helping you build your confidence and competence, but also minimising these various different costs that are involved in poorly managed conversations, whether that's cost to your emotions because you're worried or concerned, whether that's cost to your organisation, both internally and externally, in terms of your employer brand and your product or service brand, all can be impacted by poorly handled, potentially difficult conversations. Can we have the next slide, please? So at the moment, I'm finding in my work coaching, and I'm sure Fiona's the same, that a lot of people are spending a lot of time thinking around issues around people returning to the physical workplace, or perhaps even returning to work at all after part-time or complete furlough. That people are having troubles dealing with remote working. I was listening to a podcast this morning as part of the Go Through People series around trust and remote working. There's a lot of potential restructuring about to happen. Perhaps furlough extension has delayed it, but nevertheless, we expect to see more restructuring in organisations over the next 6 to 12 months. And as a result, unfortunately, we expect to see more redundancies as well. All of these situations, as well as many others, potentially involve tricky conversations. And we'd like to help you with those today. Have the next slide, please. So the first thing we'd like to ask you is, what one word describes how you feel about having a potentially tricky conversation? And I'm going to hand over to Fiona to give some instructions on what we're going to do. These responses will be anonymous, and also we will share the responses later on when Fiona talks a bit more about how we manage our own emotions. Fiona, instructions are in the chat box, is that right?
They certainly are. So you've either got a link to cut and paste into your browser, if you're using a computer laptop, or you can use a code by accessing menti.com on your phone, and the code there is 696974. So 2 routes in, one using your browser, or one just accessing www.menti.com and using the code 666974. That's in the chat, and I'm going to open up Menti now and have a look and see. We've got 10 responses so far, so great. Thank you very much. And you're just one word that describes how you feel about having a potentially tricky conversation. What are you saying to yourself as you prepare and get ready for that tricky conversation? So we've got 20 now. Emily, how many have we got online? 37, I can see, sorry. So yeah, we're still increasing. So thank you, everyone. We'll leave that open.
Fiona's going to talk shortly about how we manage ourselves in these conversations, and we'll feed back the result of the Menti survey when we come to that point. Can we have the next slide, please, Emily? So this is what we're going to cover today. We often run this workshop as a half-day workshop, or we've run it online as two-hour workshops. And what we're giving you today is like a distilled version of that in the hour and a half we've got. So we're going to talk about how we manage ourselves, and Fiona's going to talk about that. We're going to introduce you to what we call the shape of the conversation. Fiona and I are going to do a bit of a demo, and we're going to ask you what you observe. Proper practice is something we normally do at the end of our half-day course. We won't have time to do this, but to really get the most out of today, we'd like to encourage you after the session to think about how you're going to do some proper practice. So how are you going to practice some of what we talked about before you do it for real? So one of the things we always encourage our participants to do is to think about a trusted colleague or friend who can support you with this, who you can practice on, and who will give you constructive and useful feedback. So we'll start off by thinking about how we manage ourselves. Next slide, please. Sorry, I've jumped one. Ignore me for now. We'll start off with the shape of the conversation. This is what we call the shape of the conversation. And as you see at the bottom there, we've got preparation in a much bigger box. The metaphor we use is that having a conversation, particularly a tricky or potentially tricky conversation, is about thinking about the metaphor of it being like a building. And if you're building an extension or building a new house, if you don't get the foundations right, then the house is likely to develop cracks or even fall down within the next 3 to 12 months. And we think the same way about a conversation. The conversation, if the preparation isn't thorough and complete, then chances are cracks will appear when you're actually sitting opposite the person or the people that you're having the conversation with. And it's less likely that you'll have the outcome that you hope to get. It's not impossible, but it's definitely less likely. So we're going to talk about preparation largely today. And one of the things we need to do when we're preparing our conversation is to do what I talk about as being get ourselves sorted between our ears. What's going on between our ears? What are we telling ourselves? So I'm going to hand over to Fiona at this point to think some more about what goes on between our ears, what we tell ourselves and how we can handle ourselves the best way possible. Fiona, over to you.
Thank you, Diane. Next slide, please. Emily, thank you. So I wonder how many of us actually prepare for any of these conversations. And I bet that most of us probably focus on what are they going to be saying? How are they going to be responding? Oh, how does that make me feel? And we actually aren't very conscious about our own preparation. So I'm going to share, please, if I can share screen. Thank you, Emily. I'm going to share the Menti, and here we can see, that's the wrong one, that one there, okay. See what we're actually saying to ourselves. How does this make us feel? So in preparing for these tricky conversations, we're thinking about everything that they might be saying, but in the reality, it's that apprehension. We're anxious, we're nervous. We're uncertain. So the bigger the words, the more often you have used it. And we've got 27 people who've responded to this. So thank you. So yes, we're hesitant, we're nervous, we're uncomfortable. So what does that say about that conversation that Diane has mentioned? That what are we saying to ourselves that's happening between our ears? So I'd like to help you work on that. I'm going to stop sharing screen and we go back to the next, to the current slide, please, Emily.
Just to say, Fiona, those are the responses we typically get. So if you're wondering if it's just you, it absolutely isn't. We've run courses many times over the years, and those are very typical responses. You are not alone.
Absolutely. And even I would suggest that we get anxious and apprehensive when we have to have a tricky conversation. So yes, it's very common. And actually, it's quite helpful as well, because it helps us to prepare ourselves. If we're feeling that before, what are we going to be like through it? So if you are using any of these words, first of all, recognize what you're saying to yourself, bring it into your consciousness and identify. I'd suggest you get a pen and paper right now and write in front of you 2 columns. One is headed unhelpful and the other is headed helpful. And start to list now under unhelpful. What am I saying to myself in preparation for these conversations? What is the language I'm using that is helping generate that anxiety, that nervousness? So I might be thinking, oh, I had a really tough time last time. So it was tough. Tough would be a word. Oh, I'm not feeling too great. I wonder what I'm going to be feeling like tomorrow. So how do I feel better? So what are the things I'm saying to myself that make me anxious, that drive that apprehension? Bring them on into your list in front of you. And now I want to ask you to think about, so what can I be saying to myself that's helpful? So I'm telling myself this is going to be difficult. What would I be saying that's helpful? Well, actually, I bet it's going to be difficult for the other person too. So actually, we're both going to be feeling in a similar situation. So we'll both be experiencing some degree of apprehension. So we'll both be feeling like this, probably. What else could I be saying? well, actually, if I look on last time, it actually went a lot better than I thought it would do. So actually, they were really pleased to have that opportunity to have that conversation. The other person had been aware there was something needing to happen, but hadn't had the courage, as I was struggling with, to actually have that conversation. So the relief, there's a relief for both of us in having this conversation. So I'm just going to give you a minute to think through, what am I saying that's unhelpful? What can I turn that into that's much more helpful? So just leave some silence for some preparation. So isn't silence golden? How did that language and that conversation you were having change from that noisy, anxious, apprehensive one to something that was much more constructive and helpful? Well, hopefully you found that of use. So perhaps you'd like to put into chat what was different for you there. What did your language change to? What words were you saying to? And share with everybody else what impact that had for you. So next slide, please. Thank you. When we are having these conversations, we need to be aware of our own style and our own behaviour. And guess what? None of us are the same, which is an absolute delight. We are all different. And understanding my difference and how I need to adapt my style for other people is really important. So we use DISC and it has 4 different styles. Somebody who's dominant is fast and outspoken. They're questioning and skeptical. They're quite fast. You hear them. They're loud and very, very driven. Somebody who's of an influencing preference is fast-paced. They're warm. They're accepting. Normally very enthusiastic and outspoken. If you're in a steadiness preference, then you're cautious. You're reflecting. You want to support others. You accept others. And what they do, and you have a warmth towards other people. And if you're conscientious, then you're very cautious, you're analytical, you're reflective, you're questioning, and you need time to think things through before you're able to respond in an open and constructive way. Next slide, please. So normally we would profile and offer profiles out to help, and we're noticing an increase in investment in leaders and managers really wanting to understand how they can best adapt their style. And understanding our style isn't about giving us an excuse to be that style. It's absolutely about understanding how we can adapt our style to better to relate to others. So here's a bit of a quick and easy way for you to identify your style. Be conscious though, you might be thinking and placing yourself where you want to be, rather than where you are in reality. So perhaps you have a go at this yourself and then get somebody else to place where you might be. So let's look at the top part of the model. If you are fast and outspoken, you're active, you're assertive, you're dynamic, you're bold, then you're likely to be somewhere in that half circle at the top. Okay. So place yourself somewhere in that circle. Are you towards the outside where it's very obvious you're fast-spoken, fast-paced and outspoken? Or you're not quite so, you're a bit more flexible, somewhere towards the middle. What about for those of you who are cautious and reflective? Then you're going to place a dot somewhere in that other half of the circle, where you're moderate paced, you're calm, you can be relied on for that calmness, you've got a methodical approach to life and work. And you're really quite thoughtful about things. You give things thought and contribute with great consideration. So which of those half of circles are you in? Next click then, please, Emily. Now we're going to build it, where we're looking at the right and the left-hand side of the model. Are you somebody who's questioning, where you're logic focused, you like the facts, you're objective, you can often be skeptical, and you can be challenging? All great assets. And these are our strengths we're looking at. We all bring our strengths into teams and how we work. Or are you somebody who's accepting, who's people-focused, good at empathizing, good at receiving input and contribution, and like to agree with people? So are you on the left or the right? And Ellie, you're absolutely right. It depends on who I'm speaking to, because that's the next step. First of all, it's understanding where I am. And perhaps we could go on to the next slide then, please. And this is the whole model in one picture. So if you are placing yourself in the top half of the circle, are you somebody who's more dominant, or are you somebody who is more influential? If you're in the lower half of the circle, are you somebody who's in conscientiousness, more analytical, more reserved? Or are you somebody in steadiness, the bottom right, who's patient, humble, tactful, a real good team player? Because first of all, I need to understand myself and my style. And remember, this is not placing about you where you want to be, it's about placing yourself in reality where you are, which is what a profile would show you. And in understanding your own style, how do I then need to adapt my style to better relate to somebody else? Because it doesn't give me an excuse to be dominant. It doesn't give me an excuse to be influential. It helps me understand my style and how I step into the zone and relate better to somebody else. So for example, I am on the outer circle, so it's very evident that my style is a mix between D and I. And I know if I am working with somebody in C who's very analytical, who's logical, that I need to provide evidence, some facts and figures, and I need to tone down my enthusiasm. I need to be able to relate better to them in their tone, in their quietness, and in their analytical area, giving them time to think through and respond. Whereas I'm somebody who can respond quite in the moment. Somebody in C style needs time to reflect. They might not want to make a decision in that tricky conversation. You might have to create some more time to spend with them. So in understanding ourselves, then it's about understanding our impact on others and how we adapt our style to better relate to them. So I noticed we've been having some comments coming in. Diane, have you kept on top of them?
Yeah, we've got one from Tony Elvin here about used to be high D, but I've become way more I than D. Requires real concentration and focus for anything in the lower half. Absolutely, and that knowing ourselves is the absolutely important thing. And I find sometimes that people who are in the top half, so in the D and the I half, sometimes feel as though they have to handle these conversations all in one go. And then they put undue pressure on themselves because they're so results driven. They just want to have done the conversation, as it were. That becomes the prime objective. Where somebody in the bottom half here is more likely to want to have the option to pause partway through, perhaps to adjourn the meeting and come back later because they need to reflect. So I always recommend with people that having an adjournment or taking time, even if it's just to go and get a cup of coffee for 5 minutes, is a really important part of having a tricky conversation, because we all need time to check in on ourselves, to review how it's going. And if we're really high D, for example, we can be so driven that just getting a result, whether it's a good or a bad one, becomes the sort of the paramount importance. Whereas actually just ticking the box to say you've done it, and I've seen that so many times, just pushes the issue into the long grass because it doesn't really get to the root of it. So if, like Tony, you know that you're very much in the top half there, as my granny would have said, you have to get a grip on yourself and consciously, and it does take energy and focus, consciously think about how can I bring to bear different behaviours so that I not only get an outcome, but I get the best outcome that I'm looking for. And so thank you for sharing that, Tony.
Thank you. Yeah, and the great thing about that, as you've identified, Tony, is we recognise where we're at, and therefore we can adapt. It's not to say we can't do any of the other styles. It just takes a bit more energy and a bit more consciousness in stepping into that area. And well done, Tony, for recognising your impact and adapting your style accordingly.
Thank you. So we'll go to the next slide now.
Thank you. Yeah, just looking at them.
So we go back to the shape of the conversation. And we're going to talk a lot about preparation because that really is the fundamental of what we need to focus on. And so often I've found over the years, again, probably Tony, particularly people who are D and I people, tend to skip this phase. They tend to sort of go diving in and then wonder why it hasn't quite delivered in the way they hope it would have delivered. So we sort of say, okay, so let's go through a process of preparation. And then that helps slow your mind down, slow your emotions down, and helps you get you in a better place for kicking off the conversation. But before we get into the detail of preparation, Fiona and I are going to do a short demo. I'll talk you quickly through these 5 phases, and then I want you to actually watch and tell us what you see. What do you notice? So preparation we're going to come back to. Opening a conversation. So if we use this as a metaphor of a building, and the reason it's this shape is partly because we started off with a metaphor a long time ago of the Swiss Ray building in the city of London that's often referred to as the Gherkin. So the opening of a conversation is like going in the front door of the building. You introduce yourself to the receptionist, you say why you're there, what you're hoping to achieve. So I've come along today to meet with Mr. and Mrs. whatever at 3 o'clock. So that's the positioning statement is our opening in a conversation. And your positioning statement really sets the tone for what comes next. So we encourage all our delegates and those we coach and mentor to think carefully about what that positioning statement is. Next, we open up in the discussion phase. So then we're asking questions. And if we had longer with you, we talk in more detail about different question types. Some of you have perhaps done interview skills training, and you've talked about the difference between open questions and closed questions. Perhaps you've talked about different types of probing questions. So the discussion phase is an exploratory phase. The conversation is broadening out. You're exploring for where there's common ground. You're exploring the other person's perspective. You're checking that back against your preparation and see where there is common ground, where their objectives overlap with your objectives. The if-then phrase is sort of narrowing down the options. So that's thinking, okay, so if I do this, then will you do that? Or if you do this, then this will happen. So it's slightly sort of a bartering phase. It's trying to work towards a solution that both parties can see there's something in it for them. Both parties are going to give and both parties are going to receive. We're looking here for a win-win. We're not looking for one person to go away feeling totally deflated as if they've lost completely. So we're looking for some element of win-win. Now, I realise in some situations that isn't possible. So going back to where we started, if we're talking about redundancies, yes, there's a period of consultation, of course, but at some point, cost cutting's got to happen in some way. So cost cutting itself might not be negotiable, but how you get there is negotiable. So the what isn't negotiable, but the how absolutely is. And the if-then phase is about identifying what that how might be in a way that hopefully can satisfy both parties. And then the closing the conversation is topping out the building. And often, again, what we find, particularly about those who are very dominant and very driven and results focused, is they get to the end, they go, phew, got that one done, tick it off the list. But they perhaps short circuit actually checking that everybody's going away with the same understanding. They short circuit agreeing what happens next, who's going to do what. And very importantly, they often don't agree when they're going to do the review and what that review process is going to be. So that's a very quick run through the model. Fiona and I are now going to do a demo where I'm going to be Fiona's manager. And the setup is that I'm asking Fiona to start returning to work in the workplace. She's been working remotely for the last 12 months or so. And as things are opening up, I want to talk to her about coming back to work. And I'm looking at her views on it and the options there. So I'll leave this model up while we do it. And what we want you to do is just tell us, what do you notice? And when you notice something, now it could be something that you notice that's very positive. It could be something you notice where you think, I wouldn't have done it that way. But we're keen to have a discussion with you. So put in the chat box what you notice, please. Can we go on to the next slide? So what do you notice? So we'll now go into our full acting mode, and off we go. So Fiona, thank you for coming along today. I'd like to talk to you about plans for you and your colleagues to return to the workplace and having worked from home remotely for the last 12 months or so. So first of all, I'm just wondering, have you had any thoughts about when you might return to the workplace and how that might happen?
Oh, yeah, I'm really getting quite stressed about it because, well, stay home, stay safe. Yeah, that's been my, stay home, stay safe, and that's what we've been doing, and it's worked well. It's worked really well, work-wise, and home-wise. Yeah.
Okay. So absolutely, we've all wanted to stay safe over the last 12 months, 100%. As we're now moving towards more people being vaccinated and infection levels and hospital levels are slowing down and gradually we're opening up, we're not looking for people to return the next couple of weeks, but we are looking at a long-term plan over the next 2 to 3 months. So I'm wanting to explore with you and your colleagues, if we sort of go forward to June time, when hopefully the government's roadmap will be followed through by then. What are your thoughts about coming back to work a couple of days a week at that stage?
Wow, I just feel, gosh, a couple of days a week is not 5. Wow, that's a pleasant surprise, because I've been really trying to figure out, it'll be sunny. So that immediately springs to mind. And last year, we were still in lockdown, weren't we? But the summer was so much easier. So June has just kind of lifted me 2 days a week. That's actually is, I'd like to think that through. I really like to work out what 2 days might look like rather than 5 days right now.
Okay, so we're looking at 2 days initially, and at some point we'll be looking to increase that, but at the moment we're looking at 2 days. So tell me how that might work for you. What would you want from us to make that work? So
2 days of juggling with family. I no longer have access to that support that I had previously, having lost a really close family member. So
I'm sorry to hear that.
So there is that whole degree of, whoa, the whole world is different in so many ways.
Okay. So in terms of making arrangements, how do you think you might move forward on making arrangements so that you could do the full 2 days?
Well, I think, like anybody, nothing is clear right now. But where I am now currently, I've gone from 5 days to 2 days. There's so much more potential in that, so much more. It's not so huge in front of me right now, and it's June. So I think, I mean, we're not speaking to people, are we? So we don't know what the availability of people are, where they're at, what's going to be open. But I now need to start working on understanding what's available in terms of wraparound care for the kids. That will work on that flexibility in terms of 3 days at home and 2 days working initially, because that's a step forward, isn't it? It's a first step, and we're now in March, so 3 months away. I should be able to work on that, and certainly we're not sure what's happening to my husband and his job. So so many things. There's nothing is certain nowadays. It's just absolutely just now I've got something to aim for. It's like you've given me a target board. So there's something I can start pinning to. That helps. Thank you. So that's great. I just wanted to flag up, those are our plans. Those are our aspirations. I'm checking in with people to see what their thoughts are around it. In terms of next steps, what would you like to happen next? Well, now I can have a conversation with my husband. Now I actually feel a bit of a weight off my shoulders, because there's a bit of clarity. June, what I suppose what I'd need to, what's the phased return to 5, and does it need to be 5? What's the reality?
Yeah.
You know, we worked so well at home. Why do we need to be coming back five days a week?
Yeah.
And I can start actually looking forward to what I used to enjoy when I was in the office, with people, socializing. Once I get over that, keep safe, stay at home. Yeah, stay safe, stay at home. So I now need to broaden my thinking beyond the front doors and start looking to see what might be available and what's going to be out there for me. Thank you.
So what I'm aiming to do is that by the end of March, I'm aiming to start to put some more concrete plans in place for people to return, days of the week, that sort of thing. So what I'd like to do, Fiona, is if you can, as you say, go and talk to your husband, think about care for the children. If we could meet again in 2 weeks' time, and you can share with me where you've got to with your plans, I can share with you how the plans are developing. We won't share any confidences around other employees in the same way as I wouldn't talk about your arrangements to anybody else. But a picture will begin to emerge. And as you say, at some point, we'll be looking perhaps to increase beyond 2 days to 3 or 4 days. I think it's highly unlikely we're going to move back to everybody being in 5 days away a week. We've learned an awful lot this last year about how we can work differently. But certainly the initial step is 2 days a week come June time. So if we can meet again in 2 weeks' time, you go away and have your conversations. I'll continue to have conversations with your colleagues, and we'll talk individually in 2 weeks' time, one-to-one, the two of us. But my plan is really that by the end of February, we can come together as a group and we can share what we're going to do. Okay, and will I have choice about the 2 days I have to come into the office? How do you intend that happening? At the moment, I think it would be good if we have at least some time where we're all in together. Okay. It makes communications and planning so much easier. Okay. And I think it does good to all reconnect at a social level, really. That would be great. Looking forward to that. My aim would be that we have, if you like, some core time. Quite how that's going to work, I don't know at this stage, but certainly my aspiration is that we have some core time, or we have some time, perhaps every other week or every 3 weeks, where we're all in together. Yeah. Really early stages and thinking about that. But if we can all start doing some preliminary investigations, as it were, then my aspiration is we come up with a plan that satisfies all of us most of the time. All of us most of the time sounds a really great way to approach it, and I really thank you for that forward notice, because I'm aware of some of my friends, and it's like next week, and it's whoa, that's huge, and it is huge. It's huge for us all, and so thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation and to start working forward in whatever way that looks like. I've got no idea right now. Thank you. Okay, thank you, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you. Thank you. That's the end of our performance. Oh, we'll have a quick flick through the chat. Oh, this is an interesting one. Diane's putting Fiona on the spot. I wish I could get Lorraine in at that point, but I'm afraid I can't. So interestingly, and there is that whole emotional, it's that whole emotion. I mean, I was there. I was in that really, oh my goodness, a reality of life has got to change, but actually I'm so used to being in my comfort zone. And I think that's where so many people have had to live in a zone of comfort. Whatever that zone has been, might not have been their zone of choice, but it's where they have been for the last 12 months. And some will be so thrilled to get back to work. They'll be saying, June, can I not start next week? Yeah. So there's quite a few comments which absolutely reflect the speed that we rattled through that. Normally when we do this and we've got a full half-day workshop, Fiona and I would spend 15, 20 minutes on that conversation. And the point is, but yes, Diane needs to back off. Absolutely. And I absolutely would have backed off had we had a half day to do this whole workshop. So you're absolutely right. I wouldn't have gone to resolutions quite so quickly. I would have held the silence much more. I would have let Fiona have more reflection time. So you're spot on in noticing that. Absolutely. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I felt.
What did you, oh, that's a nice one from Francesca. Diane is putting Fiona back in control by asking her what she would like to see happen next. Absolutely, we try to say rattle through that. It's not a realistic conversation, as you guessed, by any means.
It kind of amplifies, though, the depth that people will need to go to take on whether or not it's the right thing for them. But that shock of that reality for many will be quite significant. And it is about creating that space for that person to be themselves, to respond in a way that is appropriate for them.
Yeah. So that was a very much a curtailed version of the conversation that would have taken much longer and be much more expertly handled, I'd like to think. Did you notice? Sorry, Fiona.
I was going to say, and the last one from John saying, did we keep in touch over? And if you haven't kept in touch through as regularly as perhaps you could have done, if you're not aware of circumstances, then that re-engagement has to happen before you have this type of conversation. There needs to be that connection. I'm a human being. I might not have been at work and you've been working your guts off while I've been on furlough, or whatever the case might be. We all have had a different experience, and it's about stepping into that zone and really connecting with somebody in what has been a highly emotional and crisis for some people, when in reality, you've probably got no idea of what's gone on in their life in this last year.
Absolutely. So having done, and interesting enough, I have seen managers who have rattled through a conversation like that, at not quite such a fast pace, I have to say, but nevertheless have rattled through it and practically forced the other person into submission. So that was by no means a representation of our normal style, I hasten to add. But it does illustrate very well for those who just have getting a result as their primary objective, how easy it is to force the other person into a position. Absolutely. And almost bamboozle them with requests and questions and ideas and timescales. So if you are somebody who is very results driven, back to what Tony shared with us earlier, then be mindful that you don't want your conversation to be like the one Fiona and I have just had. That is absolutely not the way to do it.
And did you notice the power of silence? That is one of the best techniques that we have in times like this. It is that absolute allowing the other person to respond, because as leaders, managers, our initial reaction is to fill that space. Actually, if there's any time like this, is when to bite your tongue and allow that person to really be able to respond rather than react.
As a general sort of guideline, and I hope I stuck to this, we would suggest that the manager, myself in this situation, is talking far less than the other person. Because as a manager, we're looking to explore. We already know what we're going in with, and we're there to learn. And if you like, the mindset we should have, what should be going on between our ears, is about being curious. We're curious about the other person's situation, about their objectives. We're curious about what the outcome might be. And we're not there to always come to a predetermined outcome.
Absolutely. And that outcome could be, let's come back when suits you, when's a good time for you. I can see the children are running and around in the background. And the reality is, if I was homeschooling, I wouldn't have my camera on. How would you know what my reaction is? And how would you encourage me to put my camera on so that you can actually see my reaction and get that full experience of what's happening? So that's something that we meet quite frequently, isn't it, Diane, on these sessions when we, what I call speak to a brick wall. How do we encourage that person to really come forward? And that's part of your email, your brief beforehand, is to encourage them to start with a camera. And
so perhaps this is a good point
to join you.
So perhaps this is a good point to move on to preparation. Can we have the next slide, please, Emily? So I mentioned about preparation. So these are the things we would encourage you to think about when you're preparing for a conversation. So Fiona's already mentioned about people being at home, perhaps young children around them, though hopefully most people will be free of that come next Monday. But think carefully about where you're going to have the conversation, by which I mean, are you going to do it remotely? Are you going to ask people to come in face to face? So how are you going to have the conversation? Back to the point about, are you going to ask people to put their cameras on in which case give them advance notice of that ideally. And when are you going to have the conversation? Certainly over the last few months, we've been advising people not to have the conversation at, for example, 12:30, when those who have young children at home are likely to be serving up sandwiches, crisps, fish fingers, whatever it might be that they have for lunch. So that when, the where and how hopefully can be by mutual agreement. Who needs to be involved? Sometimes it's a good idea to go and actually talk to colleagues. Get a full round picture of the situation. Don't assume that you as a manager or as a leader or as a HR person already know the full picture. Go and do some research for something that might just give you an insight into the other person and into their situation. Do you know the relevant facts, policies and procedures? In that example there, was I sure that my company's policy was 2 days a week? Or was that just me doing my own departmental thing? And then I risked the person coming back and saying, oh, well, Marion in finance, they've only been asked to come back 1 day a week initially, because I've been told that's the company policy. Or I've been told company policy is X, Y, Z. So make sure you know what the policies are. And I recognise that can be a really quickly moving situation. Know what the procedures are. Often we have delegates in our courses who want to talk about absenteeism, absence problems. And we say to them, be sure you've got their absence records there. Be sure you know what the policy is. Be sure you know what the usual practice is. Before you go into a conversation, do you really know what your goals are, both your desirable goals and your essential goals? I find quite often that delegates get confused between these two. And the danger is you end up with a conversation where you've got what's desirable, which might just be getting through this conversation, but you've not really focused and achieved what you want as an essential objective of the conversation. So really think through, what's my bottom line here? It's useful to think through what might be the goal of the other person, and picking up the point about have we kept in touch over the last 12 months. If I've kept in touch over the last 12 months with my colleagues and those who work with and for me, then I should have a clear understanding that they have children. Hopefully I'm already aware that their arrangements are no longer in place for looking after their children. I hopefully already understand that they're concerned about how they'll return to work and how they'll make arrangements, and already understand that they'll need time to put that in place. So if I already have a sense of what the goal of the other person is, it helps me really position the conversation in a way that's most likely to have a positive outcome. Doesn't mean that I have to agree with the goal of the other person or totally accommodate it, but it gives me an insight into their world and their needs. And lastly, we always recommend that before you go into a potentially tricky conversation, that you write out your opening statement and your opening question. And bizarre as it might sound, that you actually speak it out loud. Fiona knows from me sharing this in the past, certainly early in my career, I would start off with an opening statement, perhaps in negotiations with trade unions, whatever it might have been. And as the words came out of my mouth, I think, oh, I didn't know it was going to sound like that. It's amazing how differently it can sound when the words come out of our mouths. So find yourself a friendly person, a trusted colleague, and ask if you can practice with them. Say the words out loud and ask them, how did that sound? Was it clear why I was having the conversation? Did I use any jargon that other people might understand? Did I say anything that might just jar with the other person? Because your opening statement really does set you up for what comes next. Fiona, is there anything you'd like to add around that?
In terms of preparation, I don't think, well, you can over prepare, but if you go in without it, you're certainly not going to feel as comfortable and composed, I think is a good word in terms, yes. And that will come across. Your recipient on the other end will be aware of your pausing, your hesitance, your lack of confidence probably would come through.
Yes, and it's back to managing ourselves. We find with many people that once they've realised that if they prepare thoroughly and prepare both what they're thinking, back to Fiona's point earlier, turn the negative into positive, and they prepare their information, their facts, it gives them a sense of confidence that they don't have otherwise. So we'd really encourage you to think about that. Can we have the next slide, please? And I'm going to hand over to Fiona.
So thank you. Great, Diane. Always useful to hear all the great hints and tips that you're sharing. So thank you. This is a technique that you can use either in writing a communication, preparing for a communication, having a conversation, any of the above. And we've used this in many situations as an influential technique, how to influence others. So let me give you an example, and we're going to continue with the same example, somebody returning back to work. And we would start with, or I would start with, and here's a hint and tip, use I. When you are having a conversation like this, always own. Take ownership of what you've got to share. It's not they have said and I've been told to. I. Using I really helps you build that rapport and that connection with the other person. So my reason for contacting today and putting this time aside is to explore with you how you will be returning to work for 2 days out of 5 potentially going forward. That would be my reason for having the conversation. Now, this is me in either having the conversation or preparing. And so at this point, I'd probably say, so what are your initial thoughts of coming back for 2 days? And in my preparation, I will have thought through the advantages from their perspective. I'll know this person well enough to have thought this through. So I would continue in the conversation by saying, well, actually, what I've seen in terms of how you've adapted to home working, you know, I'm very conscious that flexibility is important to you. So I'm stepping into their shoes and looking at the advantages from their perspective. I would suggest that most of us, when we talk about advantages, we talk from a business perspective, but here I am, I've done my preparation, and I'm stepping into the shoes, and I'm going to share 3 advantages I think that are really important to the person I'm speaking to. So back into role play. So the advantages from your perspective, I really think are your flexibility and how you've really adapted to the flexibility and how important it is to you at home right now to have that flexibility with 3 days at home and 2 days at work in the workplace. I've also recognized how well you've adapted to home working. It really works for you. There's some people who really struggle with it, but I've noticed it really works for you, that time at home. And I also know that when you're in the office, what a great role you have in team motivation. You're a great team player. And coming back into the office, I'm really looking forward to seeing you reconnected and reconnecting with your colleagues and really sort of invigorating them, enthusiasm in your normal way that you do. But I guess from your perspective, you know, I'm conscious that times have been tough. So I'm now in their shoes. I've thought through. I would be having a conversation. I wouldn't just be going through in one flow. So from your perspective, what does that feel like? Tell me your reaction to coming back to work. And in my pre-work, I'd have thought about their reaction, and I'd be conscious to how they might be pushing back or where I've tapped into the emotional bits that are important to them. So in their shoes, I've prepared for what either pushback or acceptance. And or in my communication, if this is a written communication, I'd be writing down, so actually I understand from your perspective, or I believe from your perspective, this might come as quite a shock. I've stepped into their shoes. Then it's important for me to share success. And that success is based on perhaps what's happened with other people. So in this conversation, I would be sharing how we've been listening to and working with your colleagues, and how successful it has been for the majority of people who've actually come back to work, especially those key workers, in terms of they've been able to return to work, how we've come to an agreement that works for both parties in that ability to be able to come into the workplace. And I'd also be sharing with them what we did in terms of them returning to work. So we've developed video content so you can see what the workplace now looks like. You can see how we're managing your safety when you come back to work in terms of COVID. And we've also been providing access to external advisors, people you can speak to just chat things through and really get another perspective. And what we've really noticed great success is where the line manager is working with you to make this happen. So I'd be referring to the success stories, thinking about what's important to them. And I would be ending as Diane did in the previous one. So what's your perspective? Help me understand. And let's get back together at the end of March and really work this through with the rest of the team members, but also bringing in your perspective so that it's important we can pull together to make this work for everybody. So it's a technique for influencing. It's a technique for you to be able to either provide something in writing or prepare again for how you encourage people to come back into the workplace, to influence their productivity when they come back, to help them be the best they can be. Diane, comments, thoughts?
So what I would say with this one, and the point to emphasize, as Fiona absolutely has done, is what's in it for the other person. So we'll have a lot of people who are coming back into the workplace in the next few months, the physical workplace, or returning from furlough. We'll have people who have been perhaps asked to do things differently. Perhaps there's been a restructure, a redundancy program, the focus of the business has changed. There'll be lots and lots of changes that continue over the next 12 months to 2 years. And a lot of people want to know what's in it for them beyond continuing employment. So if we can step into the other person's shoes and clarify for them what's in it for them, then we're more likely to re-engage our staff and our colleagues in a really effective way. We're also more likely to see, I think, productivity and effectiveness increase significantly. It's very hard, I think, as an employer, and I can think of managers I've worked for, who everything was about what was in it for them, nothing about what was in it for me. And I was very unlikely to exercise any discretionary effort or commitment for somebody who only thought about themselves and didn't think about me. And I'm guessing a lot of us have worked for managers like that. So if we really want to re-engage with our staff and our colleagues, then we really need to think about what's in it for them to return to work, to make changes, to contribute in a different way. And that's the bit people often do forget.
So it'd be really interesting to hear what you're doing. So we're conscious, we've shared some examples of what people are doing to encourage that, or to reduce the apprehension of people coming back into work by doing videos. We've heard of organisations who are holding induction days for people coming back. But how do we create and build that relationship back with people who have been furloughed perhaps, and those who've been key workers at work? How do you create those relationships? Think about using this type of communication, encouraging people to share their realities of what they've been through, to really start to build that whole workforce who are clear about what's expected of them. And certainly that's something we're hearing as well. Be very clear about your expectations. What do you expect from them when they come back? What is it going to be like for them? Help them understand, what they need, but you also need to be very clear about what you expect from them coming back into the workplace. So we're getting some, Angela is saying we're giving them discretion so they think for themselves with a general line that we're giving them. Okay, yeah, so you're setting the boundaries and you're helping them create that solution. Brilliant. And Rob, so yes, if it's truly bad news, such as redundancy, it may be necessary to reconvene as the shock will limit their information retention. Most definitely. Do they need to come in with somebody? Do they need to be have somebody with them? Most importantly, how can you get them on video to be able to manage that reaction so much better as well?
Absolutely. And what support can you offer them? So whilst it might be redundancy, what support can you offer them? So again, stepping into their shoes, what support can you offer them to help them think through what their options are, to think through how they're going to move to another role, to think what their lifestyle options might be. Are they going to go self-employed? Do they want to be employed? Are they going to retire early? By being able to offer people some support and space to think these things through, we can change a potentially tricky conversation to something that's more productive and more positive. Yes, they're still going to be made redundant, but it doesn't have to be quite so crushing as it would be if we didn't step into their shoes and offer them some support.
Absolutely. So shall we open up to questions and answers? Yep. We've got a Q&A section. Please, have you got questions for us? Please continue to share and chat. There's some great hints and tips coming from people. So in terms of support, Diane, what support is available through Work Horizons for people, especially if redundancy is the topic?
A variety of support, really. So, and it's support around an online tool that people can use to help them think through their different options, and also support around potentially either group or one-to-one coaching, and also support with preparing for interviews, preparing CVs, a whole sort of list of different support mechanisms that we can offer.
And there'll be a lot of people who probably haven't done a CV for a long time or even know what a CV should look like.
Absolutely.
I've certainly been helping graduates recently as well, getting into the workplace, and inevitably for graduates first into the workplace, it's a huge step, isn't it? So there will be a lot of people requiring support in CV, interview preparation, and managing themselves through it, most important.
Absolutely.
It's a very lonely space, having been made redundant 3 times myself. But that support is worth its weight in gold. So we're not getting any questions. Here we go, we've got some comments. In the bottom circle in personality, do you have any suggestions for talking with someone who's at the top of the circle when historically they're bulldozed me? So that's a really, Sue, thank you for sharing that with us. I would actually, there's a couple of techniques, and I'm sure Diane's got some, but actually I would ask them to pause. I would actually ask them to give you time, please. I really need to understand what you're telling me. Please, can you just pause and give me some space to be able to think through what this means to me right now? So I would really ask for that pause. You might even ask them for the opportunity to have a 5-minute break, so that you can compose yourself and have that response. Or actually, I need to make a phone call. I want to chat this through with somebody else and get some advice. Can we reconvene? I would appreciate that space for me to be able to think this through. I need this space to think through.
And I would say to all managers, ideally at the beginning of a conversation, to be able to say in that opening statement, if at any point either of us want to take a break to grab a cup of tea and just reflect on what's been said, then that's fine for both of us to ask for that. And then the other person doesn't feel as though they feel as though they have permission to ask for that break. So as a manager, if you're having that conversation, then set that up as an expectation or something that's perfectly normal at the beginning of the conversation. But as Fiona says, I think just saying, I need 5 minutes to think about this. I'm going to make a cup of tea. Can we reconvene in 5-10 minutes, by which time I've got my thoughts together.
And being quite honest with this person, yes, bulldozing. They're probably not quite used to somebody actually responding to them and setting their expectations of what they need. So and actually using words like, I need you to listen now, please. I need you to listen now. So you're setting your expectations of them. They've set them of yours. They've probably bulldozed you. And actually you need to now give them some expectations for me to be able to give you or to give the business the answer, a real considered answer. I need time for this, please. So I would say pause. We've got a great pacer, haven't we? Pause, just by saying, well, thanks for that. Acknowledge what I think you've just told me is. So PAC, clarify. So I really need to understand what you've just said. Can I just think through for a few minutes what you told me? And then respond. So, okay, so this is pacer, PACR. Respond by saying, now is not a good time for me to make this decision. I really need time to think this through. So when can we reconvene, please? And that's pacer. PACR. We can write something up in chat for you, or send something out if you want to give us your email address. Send something out to you. Pause is great.
We've got a question from Richard. How would you approach getting talking staff about change to contracts and introducing a requirement to be vaccinated. Richard, I don't know about Fiona. Well, I do know Fiona. I think neither of us are in a position to answer that question, to be honest, at the moment. But we do have a colleague who'll be very happy to talk to you about that. So, Richard, if you could put your contact details in the chat, we'll have a colleague of ours who's more of an expert in these matters come back and pick up a conversation with you. If you'd like to put your email address and or your phone number in the chat, we'll absolutely ask our colleague to come and talk to you and give you a ring, Richard.
And Richard, you can put it just to the panelists, so it's not shared with everybody. Thank you, Sue, the same for you. Thank you. So there's a question, there's something in Q&A apparently. Okay. How's the best way to deal with an employee who's confrontational and overpowering? Yes, absolutely. I'm assuming online. Do you know what? We've got a mute button, and that would be your worst option, but you know what, sometimes. No, let's not use that one. So somebody who is overpowering, again, use the pacer, pause, ask them to pause, reflect back what you've heard, thank them for what they shared, reflect back what you've heard, clarify what you think that is that they're asking for, and then give your response. So somebody who's overpowering, sometimes somebody who's overpowering, it's coming across in their body language, it's coming across in their voice tone. So actually we could ask them to pause and say, I would like you to take a breath. I can see some anxiety, not anxiety. I can see that this is difficult for you. So I'd really encourage you to pause, to take a deep breath, so that you can speak to me in a tone that I find much easier to accept. Okay. So sometimes you do need to be quite clear about what you want from them. If they are losing it, then just say, now is not a good time for us to continue. I'm going to suggest we finish and we agree a time to come back by email.
I think also it's about going back to what we were saying about taking adjournments, using pauses, using silence. Sometimes silence, they almost run out of energy if we just sit there and absorb it sponge-like. Sometimes it's a good idea to say, I'd like to take a break at this stage. Even say, I feel as though things are getting a bit heated, I'd like to take a break. Take a break for 5 or 10 minutes. And then having taken the break, then think about how you're going to reflect back to them the behavior that you feel you're experiencing. So rather than saying you were very aggressive, you might say, I was concerned at the way you were jabbing your finger at me, or I was concerned at the way you raised your voice in the last part of how we're talking. So if we can actually describe what confrontational overpowering is, what form it takes, then we can feed it back to that person. What we always advise is, however, don't put labels on the person like aggressive, angry, unpleasant, whatever the label might be. Actually describe what you hear and what you see and reflect that back to the person. But not in the moment. Take a break and think about it and then feed it back to them.
And it is using that I word, I am struggling. Yes. I'm struggling. I'm finding this difficult. I need to take a break right now. Yep. So own your response. I think there are some buttons that we press when we have these conversations. I certainly hear my husband and I hear him saying, and you, and you, and you. Well, actually, what I'm hearing is what I'm experiencing right now. So much better way of helping somebody understand the impact that they're having. And yeah, own your feedback.
We've got a question here about, do we think that managers should develop their skills in mental health awareness? Absolutely. And I think if you're preparing for a potentially tricky conversation, well, a number of things there. If you're aware that there might be some mental health issues, then the preparation needs to be even more sensitive and thorough, and you really need to think about how you approach it with extra care and attention, and perhaps taking some advice, some professional advice about that. A lot of people over the last 12 months, we know there's been an increase in people's sense of anxiety because they've been working from home, they're uncertain about their employment or whatever. So it's even more important that we approach these conversations as best as we can with a compassionate mindset. We talked about being curious, but we also need to be compassionate and recognize that a lot of people have been through so much uncertainty over the last 12 months or so, that really has impacted upon their normal way of being. So we need to be really mindful of that. And also, the beauty of managers developing their skills around mental health awareness is it's much easier then for us to pick up signals that inform us that perhaps we need to step back from the conversation, that we need to go forward in a different way. So absolutely, managers should develop their skills in mental health awareness. There are lots and lots of different providers out there. If you work in a large organisation, you may well have somebody already who can support you to develop your own skills and awareness in internal training and development. If not, there are lots of good providers outside who do mental health first aid courses, both from awareness raising and 2 to 3 day courses as well, for those who want to develop their skills in more detail. So absolutely, and it is of more relevance when we're having these conversations remotely and against the backdrop of the last 12 months. So we would say, be curious and be compassionate in having these conversations, absolutely.
And help people understand the reason for the conversation. If they understand the why and the context, they can understand it's not personal, especially if it's a redundancy one, to really understand why. It's very difficult for us to provide absolute certainty right now, but what we can do is be clear about our messages, be clear about why something's happening. We're noticing, and it's certainly coming through as best practice, how leaders have been much more accessible. And great leadership through COVID has been leaders who are quite they give clarity about the existing circumstances, and they'll be very clear if they don't know something. They'll hold their hand up and say, actually, I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah.
Right now, I don't have an answer for that. So being able to give that clarity rather than certainty is the next best thing, and actually has worked really well for leadership and businesses through COVID.
Absolutely. I don't think we have any more questions at this stage, so I think we'll move on to summarising. So can we move on a couple of slides, please, Emily? So some top tips from us, and we would love to have had more time with you today, but these are our top tips for you to take away, and do contact us if you'd like to talk about it in more details. So we've got preparation there 3 times. Absolutely. Prepare for your conversation. However D you might be, or however I you might be, don't be tempted to wing it. Do your preparation. Think about your mindset. What are you telling yourself? What's going on between your ears? And how can you change any negative talk to more positive talk? Next one, balancing short and long term. Think about not only what you need to gain in the short term from the conversation, but what might be the result of that for the long term relationship that you have with the person you're sitting across the table from. What's your long term objective as well as the short term need? Think about what's your bottom line. Don't get caught up in being sidetracked by something. Know what your bottom line is and stay focused on that. I talked earlier about not putting labels on people. Don't label people. Focus on the problem, the challenge, the proposal, and focus on behaviour that you can describe. Don't focus on labeling the person, no matter how irritating they might be at times. And lastly, be specific, use facts. It's really, really important when we go into these conversations, particularly if it's a conversation about somebody's performance, that we use facts. So an example we would give is, if you're talking to somebody because some work is already late, always late, so much better to say, I've noticed over the last month that every Friday your report comes in at 5 o'clock when everybody else's is due in by lunchtime, and so is yours, as opposed to you're always late with your reports. Use the facts, have your facts to hand. Can we have the next slide, please? So that's the end, other than say next steps. So prepare always. We suggest you rehearse your conversations, find a trusted colleague or friend to rehearse your colleagues with, develop your skills. That might be your skills around language, your skills around mental health awareness, your skills around having these conversations remotely. You could always set a laptop up in a different office to somebody else and practice how you manage it remotely. We are going to send you a paper out afterwards. Well, the Chamber's going to send you a paper out afterwards around how you prepare for conversations. And then a little bit more there about work horizons. And if you'd like to join Fiona and I again, we are doing another, well, Fiona's leading another Chamber Growth Through People event next Tuesday around employee engagement. And we're also both going to be presenting at the launch of our Work Horizons Coaching Hub on the 31st of March. More details will be coming out, but we'd be delighted if you could join us there as well. So I'll say thank you for sticking with us. It's been quite a long time out of your working day, so I really appreciate you sticking with us. Fiona, is there anything you'd like to say before we finish?
Well, I'd just like to thank you all for joining us. There's been some lovely feedback, and yes, we'll get in touch with those of you who've left us emails. Thank you very much, and keep safe and
Absolutely.
keep at work, wherever it may be.
So if I can hand you back to Emily now, Emily will talk a bit more about what comes next.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, both. It was an incredible discussion. I really, really enjoyed the demonstration. And I think a lot of those in the chat, and I'm seeing messages come through as I speak, I think we can all agree that it's a particularly important conversation to be having right now, how we manage those conversations with those around us. So thank you to you both for taking the time today to deliver this workshop. And again, thank you to our headline sponsors, Aston University, BMIT College, and the University of Birmingham's Vertic Inclusivity Research Centre for making Growth Through People possible this year. As Diane and Fiona alluded to, we have some upcoming events, including re-establishing employee engagement on Tuesday, the 9th of March, which both Diane and Fiona, I believe, will be presenting at alongside Sarah Demmer, who is the CEO of SF Recruitment. We've got a number of Growth Through People workshops coming up, navigating employment supports of access new talent, supporting a pipeline of female talent, a panel discussion with the University of Birmingham's Business Club featuring from the Chamber our Chief Strategy Officer, Henrietta Brearley, and more, including our Growth Through People conference on the 30th of March. If you haven't booked your place already, we will send out the link in that post-event email. It's looking to be a fantastic conference. We've got keynote speakers in Baroness Ruby Madreda-Smith, who is President of the British Chambers and member of the House of Lords, and Jess Phillips, who is of course a local MP, also a best-selling author and a senior member of the Labour Party. And if you can spare 5 minutes, please do complete our post-event survey. It really, really helps us with our research into leadership, people management skills in Greater Birmingham, and helps our policy work in this area. And again, we'll send that link after this event finishes. So thank you ever so much. Thank you for joining us. And thank you again to Fiona and Diane for leading a fantastic session.